And I would now like to present or introduce Mac Hickley. He's a project coordinator with Alberta Environment and Parks. Mac has been with the government of Alberta for 5 years. First with the Land Use Secretariat, then working on consultation policies with Indigenous relations, and now delivering a watershed resiliency program. He previously led a watershed group in Calgary, advising City Council, advocating for rivers, creeks, and wetlands, and working to enhance public awareness. Mac is also currently a member of APPI Council. Mac's presentation will introduce integrated watershed approaches, collaborative community action, long-term resiliency, conservation, restoration, enhancement, and stewardship. He will also discuss how watershed resiliency program, how it has been developed. So it's a Riparian Setback calculator, as mentioned by Judy, for municipalities to use. And this is especially applicable in rural and remote areas in Alberta. So please join me in welcoming Mac, and then just a note that following Mac's presentation, we will have a short question and answer period for both Mac and Judy. Thank you.
Switch up to yours real quick. Okay, thank you everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to see all these interested planners in riparian areas and the ways that we can go about protecting them. I am a project coordinator with the Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program based in Calgary, and I'm going to talk to you a bit today about some of the work that the WRRP has done and is doing for helping municipalities to build long-term natural watershed resiliency. The government has a multi-pronged approach to flood and drought mitigation. I'm going to go through a little bit of what the government of Alberta is doing, has been doing, and I'm going to talk a bit about the importance of riparian areas and hopefully not overlap too much with what Judy talked about, but get some of that emphasize some more. I'm going to show you some examples of projects that the WRRP has funded in order to help build some of this natural resiliency to flood and drought. And I'm going to introduce you to a project that is under development now to help municipalities implement stepping back from the water. The multifaceted approach that the government's taking, has been taking since the 2013 flood, includes management techniques for reservoir storage and new additional stormwater detention facilities, where we've been building flood warning systems and emergency preparation and response abilities. And we have 2 ongoing grant programs, the ACRP, Alberta Community Resilience Program for large-scale gray infrastructure protection, and the WRRP, the Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program for watershed groups and municipalities for softer natural infrastructure. This approach, this 4-piece approach, was profoundly influenced by the 2013 flood, and also includes expanded floodplain mapping, restoration of fish habitat in impacted areas, and the rehabilitation of recreation trails in the backcountry. So the WRRP was established in 2014 after the flood to support local efforts, mainly in high priority watersheds that are highly prone to flood and drought impacts, and focusing on the key functions of riparian areas: water quality, flood water conveyance, bank stabilization, habitat and biodiversity, and some socioeconomic benefits. Now, part of this has been talked about by Judy a lot in setbacks and the stepping back from the water document that came out in 2012 and then was largely forgotten or left behind after the flood and the emergency response efforts. So the not less than 6 meters provision for environmental reserve in the MGA has been a central piece of putting the stepping back toolkit that I'll be talking about today together. There recently was a report from the Insurance Bureau of Canada that talked about the rising costs of flood events in Canada. And I'll just give you a stat from that from between 1983 and 2008, the average annual loss for floods and the associated costs was $405 million a year. Between 2009 and 17, it was $1.8 billion annually. So for the first 25 years of that period, 83 to 08, just over $10 billion was the insurance cost. For the next 8 years, between 09 and 17, it was $14.5 billion. And there's no sign that this is going to drop back down again. So my point there being that efforts by municipal governments to limit flood risk are consistent with their purposes under the MGA, some of those being to provide good government and to develop safe and viable communities. And as Judy noted earlier in her presentation, viable meaning economically stable. So a quote from this Insurance Bureau of Canada report says that the most cost-effective means to mitigate flood losses naturally with natural infrastructure are to conserve what exists naturally, to restore what's been damaged, and to replace some of the losses or some of the features that have been lost due to natural or human-made causes. And those are the 3 areas of focus for the Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program. Here's a picture from the Western Sky Land Trust of Legacy Island downstream of Calgary. This was a shot taken in 2012, in the fall of 2012, before the flood, to showcase the vibrancy and the vibrancy of floodplains and riparian areas. So that's the fall before the flood. This was during the peak of the flood. The island was submerged. 5 days later, the floodwaters are receding, and you can see a lot of sediment and silt built up on the island. Within a few weeks, the floodwaters had returned largely to normal, except for a lot of the sediment that was remaining on the island. And a year after the first photo, the island is still largely intact. The vegetation is returning, and a few pictures in the year before that, there was a little white building on the far bank that didn't stay there during the flood, and if there had been more development in that floodplain, it would have been severely damaged or lost. But the natural vegetation survived in large part. That's conservation. For restoration, here's an example just upstream of Cochrane on Jumping Pound Creek, where the flood of 2013 washed away some of the bank. You can see there was some willows planted, and over the course of about 2 months between the left and the right picture there, the shoots have already started producing leaves and plants. And that pathway along the riverbank is probably occupying, it's hard to tell the scale exactly, but certainly most of 6 meters. To replace some of the watershed features that have been lost due to urban development, the Alberta Low Impact Development Partnership has been doing a project in Calgary and Edmonton in communities. They've been building community demonstration hubs where they collect stormwater from parking lots and roads and such. And they have monitoring sensors, and it's designed to collect stormwater and build community awareness of some of the functions that are being replaced in urban areas. Sorry. This is also in Calgary, upstream of some of the farthest upstream Calgary residential developments in Griffith Woods Park. This is a pond leveler being installed where beavers are in abundance, and this leveler, this pipe goes on top of the beaver dam, and the beavers can just build more stuff on top of the pipe without realizing that the pipe funnels water out of the wetland downstream, and it maintains a constant water level without the beavers realizing it. And these devices have been installed in lots of communities in Alberta, more in rural areas, but this is an effective way to live with our neighboring species. In the rural areas, we've funded a lot of agricultural projects where there's been some fencing placed along streams and wetlands to keep livestock from entering the rivers or entering the water bodies for water, and some solar-powered off-stream watering troughs. And it's been found that 8 times out of 10, livestock will prefer to drink out of those troughs rather than walk into the river or stream directly. In Okotoks, we've funded a project, or co-funded a project, a research facility where there's a number of plots that are being studied by University of Calgary students and professors, where they isolate various pollutants and contaminants and water levels and study the effects of flooding. And Calgary, that's an image, it's an illustration of a project that's underway downstream of Englewood, where there was some significant damage from 2013. And it shows a sort of multifaceted approach to public awareness and restoration. They have riverbank restoration, they have recreational pathways and benches and interpretive signs, biodiversity enhancements, river access for recreationalists. And that's an ongoing project in Calgary. Other projects apart from the grants that WRRP has funded include maps. We developed maps for high priority watersheds that are prone to flooding and drought. We did a survey of municipalities in 2016 to find out what they knew about watershed resiliency and stepping back from the water. And that was targeted to municipalities in the high priority watersheds that were identified in the maps. And now we're working on a toolkit to help implement stepping back from the water and to target some of the needs that were identified in the survey. It's also of note in the South Saskatchewan region that the SSRP, the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, includes a strategy to implement or to encourage the implementation of stepping back from the water. So there's the document. We did a survey. We found that to the question, have you ever used stepping back from the water to inform development decisions? 23% of those responding said yes, they had. 35% said no, and 42% didn't know if they had used it or not. And of those people who didn't use it, the most common reason was that they didn't know it existed. One of the questions we asked was about the adequacy of your knowledge of riparian values. And you can see the green area is somewhat or completely adequate knowledge, and the red and pink is completely or somewhat inadequate. And it's apparent that there's a fairly high confidence level of people understanding riparian values, and the slightly higher levels or higher areas where people didn't understand were in recreation and economic development, the sort of social, softer scientific benefits of riparian areas. Another question was, what aspects of riparian management would you like to know more about? And by far the most popular response was they'd like clearer direction from the province. And a number of responses identified best practices and other resources to help them identify opportunities to conserve and restore areas in their municipalities. So how can we do it? How can we protect our water bodies and municipalities? We're developing a stepping back from the water toolkit now with two key components. The first one is a set of model policies and bylaws, so templates for municipalities to use to tailor for their own contexts and situations and adopt, and a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet that translates the information that was in stepping back from the water and calculates a setback for any type of water body that you might come across, or most types of water bodies that you might come across. There'll also be a user guide to help run through these pieces of the toolkit. So, for example, this is what a riparian setback policy might look like on the books when a municipality adopts it. You can put the municipality's name in and their numbers and special notes as appropriate. And it's important that, like all municipal bylaws, they have to be drafted with legal counsel, expert legal counsel, and adequate resources are needed to monitor the compliance and enforce where necessary. In the toolkit, as it's developed so far, we have templates for cosmetic lawn fertilizers, unauthorized use of reserve lands, removal of riparian vegetation on private lands, management of lands adjacent to water bodies, a natural area land use district, and other land use provisions or land use bylaw provisions for riparian setbacks. This is what a policy would look like or could look like, where there's a number of whereas statements, whereas this and this and this. We now hereby adopt a policy to protect riparian areas in our municipality. There's also a model riparian setback overlay for the land use bylaw. So as we've seen with Judy, there's a step-by-step approach listed in Stepping Back from the Water with recommendations and detailed diagrams and tables. This delineation of setbacks, like the legal counsel for policies, setbacks need to be delineated by people qualified to make these assessments on a case-by-case basis as necessary. Any of the steps, defining the scenario or summarizing the key information or vegetative filter strips, any of these steps may require input by biologists or hydrologists or geologists or surveyors, and may also require field data. So it's not necessarily a desktop exercise. This shows one of the figures in Stepping Back and some of the features of riparian areas and how they interact with water bodies. Here's another one where it's clear that, and Judy described it, actual setback widths depend on local conditions. And that's what the Riparian Setback Calculator spreadsheet looks like as an Excel file. So the setback factors, as defined in Stepping Back, are on the left, and a little description of the parameters are on the right, and the boxes in red in the middle are where you plug in numbers. Water body type can often be determined from Google Maps or Google Earth, and sometimes it's not clear, but most times it usually is. Substrate, the soil characteristics, slope profiles, shallow groundwater, fish-bearing status, floodplains, and whether or not there's an active channel. I'd like to take you through a demonstration based on a hypothetical case that I did as a desktop exercise with the data sources that are listed in Stepping Back from the Water and links to those publicly available sites. And for my demonstration, I picked a place called DeWitt's Pond. It's west of Airdrie. It's fairly well known in angling circles. It has a small cluster of houses developed next to it historically that go back years and years. I'm personally moderately familiar with it myself. My mom used to live in one of those houses. So I'm not a fisherman, but I knew the area, and I knew it wasn't at risk really of development pressure that I knew of. It's surrounded by agricultural uses, and it was just a test case that I wanted to see how this calculator worked. So there's Government of Canada information on topography and in some cases substrate. So in this case I got some You can see the pond is outlined in blue, and the elevation levels are shown on the map. The day I chose to look at the database from Government of Alberta, the geological survey data was unavailable. They were working on the website, but some of that soil characteristic information is available too if you can find it. There's a Alberta water well database that you can access, and in this case, there's DeWitt's Pond again, with a couple of water wells nearby that are listed on the website. They're unfortunately too far away from DeWitt's Pond to apply to the setback calculator. They're more than 50 meters away, and in some cases, the water information, the depth of water is unavailable if they're old records. But most of these information sources can be augmented by the municipality in question. They probably have a history of other applications or information about any water body in their district, in their jurisdiction, that isn't on the provincial or federal websites. And so local information is invaluable to filling in these kinds of information gaps. Is it fish bearing? Well, there's the Fish and Wildlife mapping tool that indicates there's a little fish icon on that pond, and yes, it is. It's actually stocked annually by the Alberta government as a recreational resource for anglers and fishermen. And so for the purpose of setbacks and whether it's fish bearing or not, that counts as a fish bearing water body. The flood mapping has been done for Nose Creek through Airdrie, but not for DeWitt's Pond. So the nearest actual flood, existing 1 in 100-year flood hazard mapping is not appropriate for DeWitt's Pond, or isn't available, rather. And so I had to skip to the next one. And is there a meander belt? Well, stepping back shows what a meander belt is, and DeWitt's Pond obviously doesn't have an active channel. It's just a pond, so that also doesn't apply to this one. Meander belts are really for medium-sized and smaller watercourses with moving channels. And setback distances, there's a formula for figuring out setbacks relative to a meander belt, and they are measured from the edge of the meander belt rather than from the legal bank, as in other water bodies. So let's see what happens when we plug in some numbers on this DeWitt's Pond case. The first box has a drop-down menu for what type of water body is it. It's a permanent, or it's a temporary ephemeral water body, or a non-permanent wetland. And depending on what type you fill in, the setback distance at the bottom will be different. So for a permanent water body, it starts out at 20 meters. For substrate, I took a shot and said, well, how far out from the bank do we go with alluvial sediments underground? And I said, well, it's a pretty defined water body. I'll say 2 meters. Why not say 2 meters? That bumps the final setback up by 1.2. Slope I got from the elevation lines. I calculated roughly from the government's website, the federal government's website, that there's about 8% slope nearby the edge of the pond. That kicks up the setback another few meters. Steep slopes, it says enter the total length in meters of slopes exceeding 25% that start within 50 meters. So within 50 meters of the bank, are there any steep slopes? And if there are, how long are those slopes? How far are they? Enter that in meters. In this case, there are no steep slopes. Shallow groundwater, enter the total width in meters of areas with groundwater shallower than 1.8 meters, starting within 50 meters. So again, you go out as far as 50 meters from the bank, and how far out does the shallow groundwater go before it gets more than 1.8 meters deep? I took another guess, well, say 5 meters, see what happens. 5 meters, it kicked up another 5 meters to the setback distance. Fish bearing status, drop down menu, yes or no. That didn't change the setback distance. Floodplains, I didn't have any information on that, but let's say that if I don't know an answer to these questions, I can't justifiably insert something hypothetically or at random. So I would have to say 0 if I didn't know or if there was no information available. But in this case, I just tried it. Let's see what happens if I put 5 in. Well, nothing changed. For the floodplain factor, it would have to be over 30.52 for this to change. It's just a straight parameter that changes by the number of meters of the floodplain. And in this case, there's no active channel or meander belt, so that was 0 too. So there we have a DeWitt's Pond case of 30 and a half meters setback based on this calculator tool. I didn't do field investigations for this. I didn't confer with technical experts very much. And before any of you or a municipality can settle on a legally and scientifically defensible setback distance, you'd have to go through a number of factors. You'd have to make sure that these numbers are ground truthed, and you'd have to look at the higher level legislation where it's applicable, Public Lands Act, Fisheries Act, Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act if necessary, Species at Risk Act, and anything else on the municipal bylaws level. And then the setback will have to be surveyed and mapped, and then the water body can be protected with the policies that the municipality has already adopted. This has been my presentation. I have been intending to bring this forward for a while now. It's still under review internally, and I'm looking for really giving some information and tools to help municipalities protect water bodies. It's not always easy for the rural or farther out from major centers municipalities to do with this kind of work because they have fewer planners on staff and they have fewer resources available to them than a big city like Calgary or Edmonton has. So I'm looking to give some information and help protect riparian areas because they need to be protected for good government and for viable communities. We have examples where other kinds of approaches can be implemented. They're valuable across, or they're applicable across the province. And so for that, I'm looking now to, sorry. I'm looking now to, how do I get this back? It's back. It's not on my screen. Pilot this with a couple of municipalities if I can. If anybody here is interested in working with me for a test of these municipal policies or the setback calculator, I'd be delighted to talk to you later at the conference or here, or contact me by email. The Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program can fund a few more projects. We're a limited program. We have 2 years left of funding, and the deadline for the next round is the end of October. And it's oversubscribed every year. We have a $32 million total program over the past 7 years, or past 5 and next 2 years, and we've already received requests for $63 million. And municipalities have the ability. We are developing tools to help, and it's listed in regional plans as a strategy to implement stepping back from the water. And so I'm looking for volunteer municipalities to work with over the next few months to see what we can do about implementing some of these tools. Thank you. So I hope I've left enough time for questions from me and Judy. Thank you.
I'll just make an announcement. So for questions, we invite anyone and everyone to ask any questions you may have to Mac and or Judy. When you do ask your question, we're just asking that you stand and introduce yourself, and I will be running around with a microphone so that the rest of the room can hear, and we of course are live streaming so that the live stream can pick up your question as well.
first hand I see.
Thanks, Matt. That was great. Or Max, sorry. Is there a website where you've got that spreadsheet or access database or whatever that was for filling in to do the toolkit that we can use now? I know it's in progress, but something that we could at least play with.
There is not a website where it's available yet. It's under development. It's under internal review by a cross-ministry advisory team, and it's not approved yet for release. But if you have an interest in working with me, I can share it with you, and we'll go through it on an individual municipality basis.
My name is Atta Mohammed. I work for Leduc County. We have a few lakes like Wizard Lake, Pigeon Lake, Telford Lake. My question is that with regards to implementation of this, one is the legal side, because you can't just guess on numbers and ask a private landowner that we need 30-meter setbacks from a development. That's very hard, like until you have all these technical details and they are being provided by a professional. Second is that whether the Alberta environment, which is a province, municipality might not have those resources, so they can at least map out the big lakes in Alberta and say that these are the setbacks you guys need to follow. Thanks.
Well, for the legal aspect, stepping back from the water itself is a guideline document. It's voluntary for municipalities. It's not a requirement it's not a policy, or it's not a piece of legislation as defined by the government. So the stepping back calculator and the toolkit are also voluntary, and the municipal jurisdiction comes in when you or some other municipality adopts a policy on your own books, whether it's the land use bylaw or some other policy that you enact, then that gives you a legal basis to enforce these kinds of setbacks.
Rick Stukenberg, Town of Stony Plain. So we're a member of the Edmonton Metropolitan Region, and we have requirements to change our MDP to focus on areas such as density, intensification, and protection of the environment. So listening to both your presentations, what advice and recommendations can you give to provide incentives for industry to do the planning that protects the environment and the landscape? Thank you.
You want to take that one? I mean, I mentioned an Insurance Bureau report of Canada that went over some of those costs. So in a lot of cases, the development proposals that come forward do a cost-benefit analysis, and I don't think I speak for the government exactly, but the time scale of those benefit analysis may not account for the time frame of natural disasters that the Insurance Bureau of Canada, and the insurance companies are on top of this probably more than anyone. They're watching the trends, and whether it's climate or development patterns. And intensification is great, and protection of environmental features is great. You have to balance the political will and how long it's going to take for the costs to pay off. Judy, you want to?
I would say ditto. I went around with Jubilee Insurance Company a few years ago to all the rural municipalities in Alberta, talking about insurance implications for flood, drought, and wildfire. Talking to municipalities about things they could do using the tools they already had in the Municipal Government Act and other pieces of legislation to do more active management and control within their municipalities and how they could avoid liability. We talked at length Jubilee has a number of workshops they put on with this very question in mind. So if you're interested in learning how these the work that you do to actively plan for and create these vegetative filter strips, how this would improve your insurance coverage, I would suggest you go and talk directly to your insurance company, because they are looking for innovations. They're looking for people who are going to set the next level of standards and best management practices. And I think you'd go a long way to improving your liability if you create these vegetative filter strips and do your best to protect your community from flooding and drought.
Khalid Mohammed, Town of High River. Thank you for the presentation, Judy and Mac. Timeline. I think Jody had mentioned earlier that, you know, municipal, federal, provincial governments are always slow in their interactions and in their work and whatnot. So the flood mapping that the province is working on, we have no idea when it will be released. But this toolkit, you said it's under review and it still is internal document and whatnot. When can we expect a final document? Thanks.
When can we? I'm hoping this toolkit can be available soon. It's got some legal and formatting issues that may have to be developed internally yet, but it's also waiting on some test cases. I need to test it in a couple of municipalities to see if it's really going to be useful and if we can tweak it a little bit here or there before it gets released publicly. I don't know exactly a timeline, and I also can't speak for the flood hazard mapping section either. That's not my division, but they're working hard. I know they are. I've talked to them.
Just to add to that all of the policies that Mac is referencing and bylaws are samples that come from Alberta. They already exist. So a municipal government somewhere in Alberta has created that sample bylaw. So they've had a legal review in their own jurisdiction, and these are just given to you as samples of what you can do for policy and bylaw. Land use bylaws have to arise necessarily from your MDP and your area structure plans and your own policies in every community. So that's a place where you can all start looking, is how does your municipal development plan reflect the new purpose of municipal government, which is to foster the well-being of the environment. We didn't even talk about that. There's also a new provision in the amendments that require that when you're preparing an intermunicipal development plan, that now you must address environmental issues that cross your boundaries, that affect each of you in that IDP area. So there's different things that allow you to be a bit more creative, working towards that new purpose, creating a tax base specifically for that purpose. There already are countless municipalities, for example, who have put in a funding mechanism in their water utility bills, whereby they ask every single resident taxpayer to provide $5 to $10, $15, $20 a month, okay, for storm drainage management systems. A lot of what we're talking about is storm drainage management. So in order to create and protect and manage those vegetative filter strips, you can be looking at these as storm drainage management facilities. Just because they're natural doesn't mean they're not facilities. That may be where you want to invest your storm drainage management dollars. That's just sort of some of the things that are already there. You don't even have to go as far as stepping back right now. That's a tool that's coming. It's going to be for you based on the gaps of information and what you said were barriers to being able to implement this guidance tool. But you don't have to wait. Why wait for spring? Why not just do it now? You already have that authority. Sorry, Mac.
No, go ahead.
But that's...
Thank you very much. My name is Dave McCrae. I'm with ISL Engineering in Grand Prairie. Question, I guess, probably to Judy. When you showed the slide with the 4 examples of what is a water body or a water course and what isn't, and A and D weren't, so on. But you made reference to one is a natural fen or a wetland, and it got me thinking about the relationship between the Act and the new requirements for ER, but how that cross-references to the wetland policy. Because the wetland policy arguably has, in some ways, more legislative clout than the MGA does with regard to ER. So I was wondering if you could just comment a little bit on that between the relationship of the wetland policy and how it relates to this whole matter.
Okay, so you're talking about some of the conflicts that you perceive between municipal planning and implementation of the Alberta wetland policy. So, first of all, the Alberta wetland policy never even kicks in, doesn't even apply, unless somebody applies to the director under the Water Act to disturb a wetland. That is when that's when that policy and the classification system and all the other tools and mechanisms, including the accreditation of the QUISPs. I love those QUISPs. Anyway, that's when it applies. But before that, it doesn't apply to private lands anywhere or to the settled area because nobody has made an application. So the way the Alberta wetland policy has been set up is that a whole bunch of work happens before the Alberta wetland policy ever kicks in. And there's an assumption made that this is happening in the planning stage by municipal councils. So if your municipal bylaw, your land use bylaw or other bylaw or policy are clearly indicating that there should be no development in wetlands, or that riparian lands need to have appropriate setbacks delineated, etc., then that is the first consideration for the land developer. They have to look at what's in your local tools. Once they've made some kind of request to develop those lands at the municipal level, because sometimes provincial directors and different staff are brought into those discussions as well, then an application goes on. So does a developer always have to work with his municipality first? Well, it's not mandatory. There's nothing mandated that a land developer has to do this pre-work before making the application to the government to disturb the wetland. So you may have a case where the land developer goes directly under the Alberta wetland policy to get an approval. What my experience has been right now is that those applications are not deemed to be complete. They're not complete. So the developer is sent back to do that pre-assessment work, that work with the municipal councils, etc. So how do you want to play it? Do you want to leave it just in the hands of the director under the Water Act? Or do you want to make sure that that particular wetland in your community has all these management policies in place and land use bylaw provisions in place, municipal development plan, area structure plan considerations in place? So I would say be proactive so that the government will send those applications back and you won't end up with an approval to disturb a wetland where you have never been part of the planning process. Does that help? So don't worry about that wetland policy. I would say leave that to the scientists. Worry about yourself.
My name is Jordan Rug. I'm from Smoky Lake County. I have a question for Judy. It's a legal question about accreted land next to a water body. So Section 89 of the Land Titles Act indicates that the property owner or the Crown can make an application to have the legal description of lands adjacent to a lake, in this case, changed to reflect that change in accretion. We're kind of embroiled in a friendly discussion at this point with the province. The land hasn't been resurveyed, so the top of bank hasn't changed, but the province is telling us that that is our land, regardless of the fact that we haven't applied to have that land consolidated into the title. I'd just like your best legal opinion on whether that is legal or if they do have to make application and have the lands resurveyed. Thank you.
Okay, so the first thing I have to do is ask Mac what your question was. I'm very, very deaf, and I wear a hearing aid, so I heard a lot of words, but I couldn't differentiate between them all. So I'm going to turn to Mac and ask, what was the legal question, okay? And then I may or may not be able to answer it here, because any legal opinion, any legal answer, always depends on facts. It always depends on all kinds of things that we need to consider before we can say, well, this is how the law would apply. So I'm going to turn to Mac now and say, what was the legal question, Mac?
Hopefully I'll get it right. So there's some accreted land,
Okay.
and it was asked. Yeah. Who owns it?
Oh. Okay. Okay, accretion. Accretion is it's a common law concept, okay? And the province of Alberta has not done anything to interfere with riparian landowner rights. So there is a time period, though, and there's a time period involved. It depends on what lands have accreted under and under what circumstances. But if you are a landowner who lives next to a water body, and over consider maybe 5-10 years, you now have all this exposed shoreline that you are expected to manage and take care of. You can apply to the government. It's a very simple application form, and ask that that accreted land now is included in your title. Okay? You can ask for that. But then, if we have several years of high precipitation events, the water levels might come up again, and that accreted land may now be covered with water, and then there's a presumption that those lands, that bed and shore, is owned by the province. I don't think they deny very many applications for accreted land when it's been 10 years where a rancher or farmer or just landowner has had to deal with access issues and other problems associated with that accreted shoreline. It works both ways, though, because once the land is recovered with water, then the province can claim the bed and shore again. If you have a survey stake, so if you are in a subdivision where there's survey stakes, unfortunately, you cannot claim accreted land beyond your survey stake. And that's just how it goes. Because surveyed land has a definite boundary. It's only if you have an unarticulated boundary, such as you own the title to all the lands that are exposed, or to the bed and shore or the legal bank of such and such a lake, that you can apply to become the owner of accreted lands. So if you're in a subdivision and you see the shoreline going out, don't even bother applying. You already have a definite boundary. In that case, though, and the municipality has taken, we don't take land in Alberta, has required the dedication of environmental reserve, and now the environmental reserve is exposed to a much greater extent. The municipality can apply to the provincial government and ask that that accreted land become part of the municipal environmental reserve parcel. And it happens all the time. In fact, I know of at least 2 cases where the province of Alberta has asked the municipality to take over ownership of that land, and you know why? It's to control access, so that somebody's managing it. Because as soon as there's that situation, citizens believe it's public land and it's a free-for-all. Nobody's regulating and controlling human access. So, long-winded answer, but it does depend on the facts, it depends on time periods, it depends on the actual lake, the history, what your land title actually says. It's quite complex. Hopefully that answered it, not sure.
Hi, my name is Imran Ahmed. I'm manager of development services with City of Medicine Hat. I'm an engineer by profession. I really like Jody's comments about engineers, and I echo with you. My question is with Mac. Again, the numbers, engineer with numbers. First of all, I would like to know, how did you determine these setbacks in your tool? Like, did you do some kind of modeling, or what did you do different than what was happening before?
The algorithms behind the setback calculator come directly from stepping back from the water, the document. So what those tables and charts in stepping back from the water show for vegetated filter strips and alluvium distances and all those things have numbers associated with them, and those are what went into the calculator spreadsheet. So it's not anything different from what's already published in the guidebook. It's just put into a spreadsheet so you can plug in some numbers and come up with a final calculation.
Hey, Evan Goldstrom with McLeany Consulting. For the setback calculator, I'm wondering, is there a maximum size for a body of water that you recommend using? I'm thinking with conditions changing around the body of water, or is it just simply a matter of kind of parceling it out based on those changing conditions?
One of the early pieces of feedback I've heard is that it's more useful for small developments, lot or a few lots size kind of thing. Once you get into an area structure plan size or a larger development along a water body, you have to do a lot more in-depth environmental studies anyway, and so you might not find the benefit of the calculator. But and in some cases, like the meander belt, it's aimed at medium size or smaller active channel streams. And so if you have a huge or a big river with a huge floodplain, that setback distance could become monstrous too. And so it's based on a context-specific sort of approach, and you have to take it case by case. More?
I don't have any comments.
Okay.
Hey guys, it's Marcus Honey with the town of Canmore. A few questions, I guess. A twofold question regarding everyone's favorite topic, environmental reserves. I know, Judy, you're kind of cringing there. So I guess the first thing is, can you just clarify, because I think there's some, I guess, misunderstanding between environmental reserves and environmental significant areas. Can you just specify between the two, because often there is that debate, and I just want to make sure everyone kind of leaves here understanding the difference.
Okay. Difference between environmental reserves and bioreserves?
Environmental reserves. And what was the question again?
Essentially the difference between environmental reserves and like an ESA.
Areas.
I'm sorry?
ESAs.
Oh. Environmentally significant areas are landscape features that have been identified by scientists, and there is a document called Environmentally Significant Areas of Alberta. This has been created and based on scientists who went out and used several criteria to establish which landscapes in Alberta were considered environmentally significant or sensitive areas. So there's a map of those. Coincidentally, most of the riparian landscapes associated with moving bodies of water have been included in the ESA maps. So ESA maps already exist, so you just go to them on the website, pull them up for your particular water body in your community. So those are established. There is nothing in law that says that you must protect environmentally significant areas. There are land use policies that exist. These were created in 1996, just after the MGA came out as a revised document. And these Alberta land use policies are still in place, and they encourage municipalities to protect environmentally significant areas. Under the regional land use plans, such as the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, municipalities are now expected to protect environmentally significant areas. So the language has changed a bit in the South Saskatchewan region. Under the LARP, there isn't that much change. And if you don't have a regional plan in place, the old encouraging land use policies apply. So that's ESA. Environmental reserves are completely different. These are creatures that are created by under the MGA. They're statutory creatures, okay? They don't exist, they're not even logical. They only exist for the purpose of determining which lands may provide development constraints or have create a problem for land developers who want to put buildings in certain locations. So, and they only come into play during subdivision applications. So during an application for subdivision, based on municipal development plans, intermunicipal development plans, area structure plans, etc., and the land use bylaw, planners work with the land developer and identify certain lands that have been described under Section 664 and say, when the land subdivides, we are going to require you, land developer, to dedicate these lands as environmental reserves. They then are owned by the municipality in perpetuity. Municipal government actually owns the title. So municipalities, in theory, are supposed to control access, manage, and conserve these lands, but in practice, they're often seen as throwaway lands, and nobody does anything with them. People go out and plant all kinds of ornamentals. People sometimes mow the grasses and demand that operations staff come and mow the grasses. They're not, there's an overlap. There's a coincidental overlap between riparian landscapes associated with moving water bodies and ESA, but they're not the same. Okay, so if you want to know what an ESA is, go and look. There's maps, and there'll be one for your community. They exist all over the province of Alberta.
No, that was great. I just wanted everyone else to leave with that information because often that is a confusion. That said, though, too, could you maybe just speak quickly about environmental conservation easements with respect to ESAs?
Okay. Now there you just made a huge error. They're not environmental, okay? They're conservation easements. And in fact, if you try and take an environmental reserve as a conservation easement, it's not going to work. Yeah. Conservation easements are landscapes that a municipal council, i.e. their administration, consider so valuable for the overall greater public interest that they're willing to buy those lands for conservation purposes. And they're not environmental reserves. They cannot be the same landscape features that you could require to be dedicated as environmental reserves. Conservation reserves must be purchased. So if you put that, for example, here's a good example, Nose Creek Park in Calgary. Nose Creek Park in Calgary, the city of Calgary tried to claim that land as an environmental reserve and say it has to remain the way it is forever and ever, amen. And the court said, no, if you want to preserve that land in the overall greater public interest, you're going to have to buy it. And so they had to, they did, they bought that land. That, under our new legislation, could have been purchased very legally during the subdivision of that area as a conservation reserve. So the problem is, who has sufficient financial resources to purchase a conservation easement? Okay? Conservation and what you can take a conservation reserve, because that is a taking with compensation, it's all laid out. What you can actually, what kind of lands you can take and how you go about negotiating for the sale of those lands. You have to pay market value. So they're new. And again, what you should know is this is a statutory creature, all right? They're brand new. It's a brand new creation by the provincial government of a new mechanism that municipalities can use to ensure that maybe large tracts of land are preserved for the future. Was that too long-winded?
Okay.
All right.
That was great. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Well, don't ever get a lawyer going on the law. We love to talk about the law, and we can bore anybody. That's why I said I don't want to bore you to death with legal mumbling.
Thank you, Judy and Mac. That was excellent. And thank you to the audience for the questions. And I think now we'll just conclude the session. And I believe that it's lunchtime. So.
Run out of